Welcome back to Tips and Tricks for Writing Manuscripts. This is episode 2. Thank you for joining us again. Now, if you remember my first episode, we covered the basics. Making time, starting good habits, doing your research and your brainstorming, and techniques to get the most out of your brainstorming sessions. In this episode, we're going to go a little more in depth with some of those techniques and get a little more nitpicky with what we're covering. So we're going to be going into the big details, the things that make up and flesh out your story, such as genre, character building, researching your theme, doing what you got to do to really bring that theme out, and little things to kind of bring it all together and how you write. So, excuse me. So to start out, we're going to go with finding a genre, finding your theme. One of the best ways, especially if you're just starting out, go with what you know, what fascinates you the most, what really gets your gears turning, what really makes you wonder, hey, what could happen? Sci-fi, country western, historical fiction, supernatural, fantasy. And fantasy is a big thing right now, but so is sci-fi. So you have like Game of Thrones. That's going to be the big contender for the fantasy world right now, and also with Lord of the Rings and so on and so forth. And then you got like Transformers and Alien and Prometheus with the sci-fi. Those are the big things right now. That's what people are into. But when you're writing a book, when you're writing a manuscript, original content, don't worry about what everybody else is into. That's one thing you really got to get in your head, especially when you get to this phase of writing, is they don't matter. The people out there don't give a shit. What you need to worry about is what you care about, what fascinates you, what really gets you up in the morning and tells you, hey, let's write. So what are you into? Find that thing that fascinates you the most. Is it comic books? Okay, let's try and write a superhero story. Is it poetry? Well, let's try and write something a little more on the human drama persuasion. Like my fanfiction Feral. That is a very human drama piece. Maybe you're into music. Well, let's write a story about a rock star on his way to the top. That's also human drama, but you can take a lot of liberties with that yourself. I mean, of course, there's always the story of the guitarist who made a deal with the devil to be the next big thing. Well, who are you willing to make a deal with to make this happen? I'll go ahead and tell you, you need to make it with yourself and tack down what is going to make up your work. So let's find a genre. It's one of the easiest things to do in the writing process is finding out what gets you going, what really gets you started. For me, it's always been fantasy, but as you write more, as you finish more work, you're going to find interest in different places. Your tastes might change, even though you still just want to do fantasy or sci-fi or western. You're going to find your interest expanding. Because I've always done questing, big, large-scale adventure-type work in fantasy, but then I've kind of bled into human drama with Feral and with even 13. Even though that was kind of comic booky, sci-fi-ish to a point, it was still very human drama-oriented after years and years and years of fantasy. So your tastes might change. They might not. Stephen King is probably the best example of your taste changing. It seems like everything he does is different. He is the master of horror, but he's managed to write so many different types of books. His Dark Tower series is like at large, America's Most Wanted, for an incredible mixture of different genres that somehow cohese into something that we all accept, believe, and love. His was his was western with history, with horror, with sci-fi, and it makes you go, whoa. So, but don't plan to write the Dark Tower, but plan your tower, that spindle of your universe, that one big thing. So picking your genre is incredibly important. You're not going to have much of a story without it. So take some time. Look at your options and eventually, don't force it to yourself, but take the time to come to the realization, hey, that's for me. Second of all, a list of characters and their personalities. This is also going to be a huge beast of burden for your book. Your characters are basically the life of your story, because yes, you can have all these events happening, but unless you have people who react and are affected by these events, it's not going to be much fun for your readers or for you. It's going to make the writing process probably more difficult when you don't have someone who can react to what you're doing. Basically, when you're a writer and your worlds that you're creating, you're God, and you got to have people who worship you. I know that sounds kind of egotistical, but it's true. You're going to have people, just like we do in the real world, that love and despise you for the things that you do. So taking that into account is going to make writing for characters really easy. But here are some basic tips to help you get to the top of the mountain with your character roster. Have variations. I mean, what kind of people have you met before? What kind of people would you like to meet before, you know, you hit the big bucket and take your ticket, you know? So, have you met a jock before? Have you met that really quiet person that kind of just hides everything? Have you met just consider who you've met in your life and who you haven't. And that's really going to help you create people for your manuscripts, and depending on what genre you've chosen, you can learn to so to speak, dress them accordingly. If you got a western, maybe you want a broad-shouldered, stubble-faced sheriff type character, you know. Or if you're writing fantasy, you're going to want that, since it seems to be the trend nowadays, that beautiful princess that can really whoop ass and take names, but nobody knows it. So depending on your genre, it's really gonna help you build these characters. But one thing I've noticed that, especially in the fan fiction universe, it seems like since you have your characters presented to you as they are, they don't feel the need to really get familiar with them. They think they know it all, or at least some of the writers that I've experienced come off like that. Maybe that's just my perception. I'm not entirely sure. But in fanfiction in particular, it seems like they feel like they know their characters well enough already, so they don't really explore the kind of personality types they are. And you lose something. You lose that authenticity, that it's not canon, it's by someone else, but it's just as good. So I've made that mistake before, and I regret it. Sinners and Saints was a Bleach fanfiction I did, and I did not do much research. I hardly even read the manga. I watched some of the show, and it interested me, and it gave birth to a story, and I wrote it, and it's not one of my best. It's not one of my favorites, and that's why. Because I used a lot of canon characters that I didn't really go into a lot of research to get familiar with. So that's why, especially with your original work, that is a mistake you cannot afford to make if you want to succeed. And by succeed, I don't mean sell copies, but I mean create a following, find fans, and bring them into your fold, so to speak. So you want to get familiar with your characters. You want to get to know them like family. Study personality types. Psychological tests, you know, INTP, ISTJ, those sort of things. You really want to get in touch with those. Get familiar with them, what they mean, what they mean for people in terms of them being that personality type. Do research on people. Psychology is a hobby of mine, and it has been extremely helpful for how I build my characters, how they react to certain situations, how they talk, how they think, you know, their decision-making skills, because I take a long, hard look at people. Because the more real your characters are in the story, the easier it's going to be for your readers to relate, understand, and get pulled into your work. And the better you can do that, the more they're going to enjoy it, and the more they're going to want to come back. So get familiar with your characters. Take the time to decide, where did they come from? Who did they grow up with, if anyone? Where did they grow up? Did they live in the wild? Were they raised by dogs? You know, take the time to nitpick where they've been. Because that's what makes us who we are, is where we've been and how we've reacted to what life handed us. So figure out what, as the god of your book universe, what did you hand these characters to make them who they are? And how did they react to your righteous fury? So that's a really good tip for character building. researching your theme and your genre. We covered research and brainstorming in episode 1. Well, now we're going to go into a little bit more detail with research, and that one of the biggest things you can do after you've picked your genre is to study authors in the same field as you. Not necessarily copy, because that's the last thing you want to do, but research them. When, let me think. I'm trying to think back to what I was doing. Dragon Knight Legacy. In the book I'm working on now, which is actually the last in the series, even though I haven't finished the one before that, I wanted to, in this other world, in Lamia, some of you who have read it will know what I'm talking about, I had to recreate the concept of hell. Because these people, though they have a form of the Christian faith, they have a completely different concept of hell. Hell is more of an idea. It's not that realm of darkness and gnashing of teeth that's actually in the text, because in Lamian canon they didn't have the New Testament, they just had the Old Testament. And through the centuries it kind of became what it is in the book. It's the idea, distance from God is their idea of hell. But eventually in book 5, there is a literal translation for hell in a descriptive paragraph. And I took what I knew from the text, the gnashing of teeth euphemism, and kind of wove my own sort of story around it, making it what it's sorry, my nose itches. So, when you, I'm trying if I remember where I was going. It's good to research the material, because now I remember. Dante's Inferno, the Inferno. That's the only part of the trilogy I've read, unfortunately. But I don't have much interest in the other two, so sue me. The Inferno is a wonderful example of imagery based on politics and religion. It gives you a lot of literal imagery, such as the burning tombs, the burning sands, the rivers of blood, and so on and so forth. It gives you a very interesting look at how everybody's perception of the afterlife can be different. In Dante's hell, only parts of it are burning, unlike the modern Christian idea of hell that everything's burning. In fact, in Dante's hell, if you haven't read it, the ninth circle of hell, where Lucifer sits, is frozen over. Hence the phrase, when hell freezes over, I guess. But everybody has a different take on the same thing, so it's good to check out other authors in the genre you've picked. King is always a safe bet, because he's touched almost everything. But just keep an eye out for authors that have done sci-fi, that have done Western, have done paranormal fiction, and other things like that. And you're sure to get ideas and thoughts on different techniques you can use as far as physically writing goes. Because sometimes the formation of a sentence can really carry the intent of a paragraph when words alone can't. Sometimes it's the way you form it that really carries it out. Let's see, what do we got here? Yeah, it'll help you find your niche, the way you tell a story that makes you different from them. Let me see. Okay, yeah. And one technique that I've found, I've called it word rhythm and voice. Now, voice is probably something you've heard in school, if you, especially if you're here in the U.S. They talk about voice. Passive voice, active voice, omniscient voice, first, second, third person, so on and so forth. I've always written in third person with little touches of first person in there somewhere. I tend to blend them depending on what I'm doing, who I'm focusing on, which characters I'm working with. Gosh, my nose won't stop itching. And those techniques alone are really great to help you decide, the feel of your story, but the genre you pick can also have a really big impact on how you write, such as fantasy. One project that I'm working on right now, Lords of Chaos, is fantasy. It's a Final Fantasy 13 2 fan fiction, and it starts out with very, I guess you could say, flowery, almost purple prose, so they call it. It's very fancy words, 50-cent words. I'm talking about big ones. So, but you would expect that in a high fantasy sort of setting. You're gonna let me think. How can I? What would be a good example? Well, narrators or Skyrim. Okay, we'll go into like Elder Scrolls. We'll go into Elder Scrolls. You could just imagine like Morgan Freeman narrating this and telling you this story, uh, and it fits. High fantasy is going to have very precise, very flowing, sometimes alliterate language, and that is the coupling of words that all start with the same letter. For those of you that don't know, you're going to have fancy words in a high fantasy. It's just one of those things that kind of brings the world together and gives you a voice in your head when you're reading that kind of helps immerse you. And then in sci-fi, it's going to be significantly different. It's going to be much more technical, much more streamlined, but also incredibly detailed. Because in sci-fi, you're creating things that don't exist. It's not much different from fantasy, but you're creating technical things that don't exist, or species that don't exist. And oftentimes you're going to have to explain to your reader how it works. So you're going to need very to-the-point, very precise language to convey that. I had to find the word. And in a Western, you're going to use, from what I've seen, you're going to use somewhat more common language, layman terms, I guess you could say. You're going to simplify it for your readers, just to kind of keep, because the West was simple, the West was rough. It was, for the longest time, untamed. So you got what you got, and what you saw was what you get. Excuse me. So yeah, carefully research your genre, and this will help you find your voice. But this can also pertain to your characters, and especially when you're describing them. But I think that's going to be covered in another episode. So let me see. So yeah, research your authors, and they're going to help you find the way you uniquely tell a story. And that about covers all the tips for this episode. So we'll do a quick recap. Finding a genre, what interests you, what really gets you excited, go for it. It's a great way to start in writing about what you know or what fascinates you. Coming up with a list of characters. Once you find a genre, this should be pretty simple, but it's okay to take some liberties, especially if you really want to make your storytelling special. Find someone a little out of the box, but they could still fit. And study personality types to help you find what those characters are like. Research your theme and your genre. Look up other authors that have done the same, that have done similar things, that work in the similar realm as you. That's really going to help you find what you need to make your story unique, and to really bring out the writer in you. And word, rhythm, and voice. Depending on your genre, this can mean a lot of different things. But it helps to talk yourself through what you've just written. Say it out loud so you hear it. And once you've built up that author's instinct, you're going to find out what works and what doesn't the more you work on it. So yeah, that covers episode 2 of Tips and Tricks for Writing Manuscripts. Thank you for joining me so much. If there's something I didn't cover or a question you still have, please feel free to ask it in the comments section. And I hope to see you again in episode 3 that will be covering storytelling tactics. So I hope you're excited, and I will see you